I just want to make your life as hard as possible, Callahan, right? Just maximize the background noise, just drum on my desk and like continuously knock my mic. And
Okay. Yeah. It's hilarious. You're doing that. One of my friends back home from Ohio messaged me the other day. No joke. And he's like, I just got this really new hobby. I was like, what's that? And he bought a fucking oboe. Or not an oboe, didgeridoo.
Didgeridoo.
And he's been learning how to play the didgeridoo. He sent me like a video of him playing that. And I was like, that is the most random ass thing.
You know what?
I could possibly like.
That's a power move. Like, okay, imagine you get in some sort of conflict with this person and he just whips out a didgeridoo and just starts.
The argument's over.
And then
you lose.
There's going to be minotaurs on the way.
And welcome everyone to another episode of the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host, Callahan. And we have a great show lined up for you all today. But before we get into all of that, just want to thank you all for joining us this week. If you like this episode or any of our other episodes, please make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below if you are watching on YouTube. If you want access to our Discord server as well as some other little extra pieces that we're working on, make sure to head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/themindsculptors or check out the link in the description. If you want to pick up any of the cards today that we talked about, you can head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link in the description as well. And I don't know how I messed that one up, but it's okay. We're going to keep going. And if you want to pick up any cards that help support the show, helps, support stuff like the MLC podcast, all the different stuff over here. So really appreciate that. Joining me today, we've got two of my fellow Sculpty boys. We're going to be talking about which is the worst of the allied color pairings. And joining me first today is my good friend, Cobblepott. Cobble, how you doing today?
Not too bad. Good to be here.
Yeah. And back on the podcast after a bit of a what's the word I'm looking for?
Hiatus.
Hiatus is Spleenface. Spleen, how you doing?
I'm doing great, and I'm happy to be back.
Yeah. It's funny. We got a comment on, was it Reddit or was it
Reddit.
YouTube? That said something. It was like, I don't know the guy's name, but the guy with the deep voice, I haven't heard him on here for a while. And we're sitting here and we're like, that could be like 3 or 4 different people. It's either Spleen, Phoenix, or Sick. And I don't think Sick's been on the main podcast. So,
yeah.
And I don't really think Sick has that deep of a voice.
Certainly
I don't either.
Not as deep. Deeper than some, but.
Your voice is so deep and so characteristic. I just remember, I don't remember which tournament it was, but you went under an assumed name and you used a voice modulator. And even with the voice modulator, we could tell it was you just because your voice is so characteristic.
So I remember that was the Time Twisted 4. I remember when I went on the Notion Thieves back when they were doing their streams, and like when they had a guest, they would actually keep it secret. Like I had a filter over my face, so it was like mostly blacked out and had like a psychedelic effect. And then I had a voice changer. And then all of a sudden I was just so conscious of every single one of my like mannerisms, figures of speech, like everything I said. Immediately I went like, that's something only I would say. People are going to figure this out so fast.
Right.
Oh, that's funny. Well, glad to have you back. First time you were on the podcast, we were talking about which shards and which wedges were the worst. And so this year we're back to do which allied color pairings are the worst. So starting it off, we're going to get it done right out of the gates. It's not because it's alphabetical at all. Is Azorius...
It's not alphabetical, actually.
Is it not?
No,
really?
It's in color order.
Oh, okay. So it's in color order. Okay. It's okay. This is totally on purpose. Anyway,
Cobblepott made the template for these. Of course, it's in color order.
Starting us off is Azorius. And so, Cobble, we were talking about this a little bit before we went on, is Azorius kind of occupies this weird space in EDH, right? Where in kind of 1v1 player formats, Blue-White has this very like defined identity, right? Yeah. It is a control deck. It's usually those sorts of things, stuff like Teferi Hero Dominaria, stuff like that is very common within that build. But then you kind of look at Commander, and it's a whole different thing. It really struggles to find its identity in Commander. So really take us through what's going on with Azorius. Why is that? What is kind of the strengths and weaknesses of it?
So to maybe characterize that a little bit differently, the blue aspect of Azorius gives it the access to the strongest counter magic, the interaction on the stack that any of the colors has. And the white aspect is focused more on permanent based proactive denial. So when you couple Azorius, especially with, the actual blue-white cards, a lot of them are permanents that are stacks kind of things. And there's an impedance, I guess, there's kind of this conflict between wanting to hold mana open to be able to interact versus using mana to get your permanents onto the battlefield so that you can, control the tempo of the game and, shut off people's win cons and so on and so forth. So there is this contrast and this desire to kind of go in two different directions. And what you wind up doing is you have to kind of pick one. So you got to pick either to go with a more, I'll say, nimble kind of, stack oriented deck where you're going to be using artifacts and, accelerating and interacting and then trying to find a way to combo off versus a much slower kind of protracted gameplay where you're doing your rule of laws and your rest in peace and stony silence and that kind of thing. So it's a, I want to say schizophrenic a little bit color combination, just because it doesn't quite know which one it really wants to be in. And we don't really have great representation for either. So as far as strengths are concerned, it's, like, as I said, denial stuff, rule of law, mind sensor, rest in peace, stony silence, those kinds of things. It does have stack interaction like silence and, angel's grace and so on. But really, it shines the most in the permanence that it can put on the table to be able to control the flow of the game. It's got good card advantage. It's got access to Mystic Remora and Study and Esper Sentinel and Time Twister and Windfall. But not having the really big draw that you get from black in, Adnos and Necro and Peer into the Abyss, it's noticeable. The tutor support is generally limited to artifacts, enchantments, and we're getting more for instants and sorceries. I forget the new 3 mana sorcery that can solve the equation. Thank you. So it doesn't have the ability to put together combos as consistently as decks that have access to black. So a lot of times it is looking for a artifact oriented combo that it can assemble because that's the thing that it has the most reliable tutor support for. Removal wise, it's pretty good. I mean, it's got the ability to remove creatures and non-land permanents, and its removal is typically exile based. So it's I'd say, at the maybe top end of the removal that's available. But again, that removal is still kind of, pushing up against that, the desire to have a board that you're establishing versus having stack interaction that you hold up. Mm-hmm. So typically it's going to be slower than other lists, especially if it doesn't have red, it doesn't have black, so it doesn't have all the rituals and the acceleration. It's going to be often running null rod effects, unless its combo is based on artifacts, because it knows that it can't outrace a lot of the decks that have access to black and red. So to slow them down, null rod effects, stony silence, that kind of stuff is going to be pretty typical, which means it's going to try to create a slower game in which it can take the time to establish itself, as opposed to trying to keep up with the pace of a game that doesn't have any denial in play.
Right.
So I think sort of that's kind of an interesting, on that point. I think that kind of puts Azorius in a rough spot, because I just don't I think it's a fact of the format that you need at least some kind of acceleration in your deck that you're planning on leveraging. So, for a lot of decks, that's artifacts. Some decks go deeper on instants and sorceries, so generally those decks will also be trying to leverage artifacts as well. And then most of the green decks will leverage creatures plus the occasional land tutor or enchantment, like your wild growths and nature's lores that see some fringe play. And so when you're looking at an Azorius deck and you can't make nearly as much mana with artifacts as something like Rakdos. But then if you play Null Rod and Stony Silence, then you just don't get any acceleration, right? Like in green, you play Null Rod and Collector Roof because it's also very accessible in green. Stony Silence if you're in white, and then you just play Dorks, and then you laugh at everyone who spent, they threw down they kept a hand that's like, aha, I'm going to untap on turn 3 with like 7 mana in play because I have this mana vault and a rock and a mox. And you're like, okay, but
I think we lost you, Spleen.
Lost you there for a second.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was saying, in a green deck, you come up against someone who kept like 4 or 5 artifacts or mana producing artifacts in their opening hand, or maybe 3 or whatever. And a mock, so they pitched a card and they spent 3 or 4 cards putting out artifact-based acceleration, and then you just slam a Collector Roof and you laugh at them and you play your Dorks, and then, you win because they basically kept a 4-card hand because you shut off all their artifacts. But if you do that in Azorius, you are just committing yourself to basically playing 1 land a turn. And so that's definitely a rough spot where if you don't hate artifacts, then Rakdos and Rakdos Plus will sort of run you over by taking advantage of them way better than you can. But if you do hate it, then you're left with nothing, and the green decks will run you over by using their creature-based mana.
Right. Well, and there's also, this is an interesting thing too that I think is, as somebody who brews a lot in blue-white, one of the interesting things that I think you find very noticeably quick is in in 60 card formats, they're generally you can have up to 4 cards of, your cards in your deck. And I think blue-white is a color that benefits greatly from that density of effects. Looking at blue, white, and modern, for instance, the amount of, we're running for counterspell. You run like 4 cryptic or 2 cryptic commands now, I guess. Now you're an Archmage's Charm, which in Modern's really good, stuff like that. You can play Teferi Time Raveler. And it's interesting to me how in Modern you notice, oh, well, we just play like 4 of this, it's fine, whatever. You move over to Commander and, counterspell's really good the one time you have it, but you only get it the one time, right? And so it's not there all the time. And so, like, is it unfair to say that blue-white suffers probably the most out of most colors that I've seen of not having multiples available to it?
So I guess I think that blue-white suffers from a slightly different problem, actually, which is it's sort of tied it, like the cards you were naming, obviously having multiples of them is nice in Modern, but I think the actual issue is that all the cards you sort of named are cards that are good in a neutral game. You play them and they take a game that's roughly even, and then they give you an advantage, right? Your opponent plays their 2-drop or 3, 2-drop if they're, let's say you're going first. They play their 2-drop. You go like, cool, untap, slam Teferi, bounce your 2-drop, like, I'm ahead. Right now, right. I have this thing on the board. You have to deal with it. You're not going to be able to deal with it on your turn because you can't cast a thing. You replay your creature. Then I get to untap. If I can kill the creature, I can start ticking up. And so in that way, Azorius decks are very good at taking sort of a neutral game and getting themselves ahead with, a couple efficient removal spells or counter spells or things like that. And in Modern, that's great because I think Modern is unstable, where advantages tend to snowball into larger and larger advantages until you can take a game and you can be winning it for 10 turns and then kind of
we lost you again there.
When you say lose me, like, can you still see me?
It's like you freeze.
I freeze. Okay.
You freeze and then you speed up really fast, like it was buffering.
That's very odd. I think it's recorded locally, so the audio should be intact. Yeah. Sorry, what I was saying is that Modern is very unstable, where winning tends to sort of snowball into even more advantage, and you can just kind of be winning the game for a long enough time that you eventually actually win the game, right? You put out a card advantage engine, and then, like Celestial Colonnade has been used as a finisher because it's like, okay, I have so much mana, I have so many cards, you have nothing to do, so we'll turn on this Colonnade and then I'll just beat you down because you have nothing left.
Right.
But at that point, it actually doesn't matter what you're killing with. We saw a Shark Typhoon in Standard recently, like that sort of thing. In EDH, though, I think the games are more stable. And when I say stable and unstable, I'm not necessarily talking about volatility in terms of how much it can swing over a turn or a short sequence of actions. I mean that a person with an advantage, if you put yourself in an advantaged position, that advantage isn't necessarily built on and maintained over time because threat assessment naturally shifts. So, drawing one extra card a turn just means that people are going to, point a little bit more of their interaction at you, and you're going to have to spend that interaction on, you're going to have to stop people rather than somebody else. And so these Azorius cards that give you that advantage, it's like, okay, now I've got a card advantage engine. I have some mildly disruptive permanent that's annoying for you. Having those in play for a length of time doesn't translate into winning the game, because somebody's either going to have a combo that works through it, or they're going to find their abrupt decay, they're going to remove it, and then you're gonna lose, and you have to spend your resources to deal with 3 people, and if you have more resources, you have to spend them disproportionately. So having a really strong neutral game but difficulty finishing or closing out the game works fine in Modern, because just lasting in that advantage state for a long time is a real strategy that eventually leads to winning the game. And in EDH, it's just not, right? Two people are going to save up. You're drawing extra cards. It's like, okay, well, I'm just going to wait until I have 4 counter spells. And then the second you tap most of your mana to play something or to deal with somebody else, then it's like, all right, I bet you don't have the mana to beat my 4 counter spells. And here we go.
Right.
And so you just can't, not being able to close out the game easily is much more of an issue in EDH than it is in Modern, for example.
And most of the other color combinations have good combos that fit into the color combination. And Azorius just, I mean, I see people using, Rest in Peace and Helm, or, Rule of Law and Knowledge Pool, or Drannith Magistrate and Ubamask. I mean, those aren't even win cons. They, like the Helm plus Rest in Peace, that only takes out 1 player at a time. So it's not really an I win. And the others are just kind of locks that also don't necessarily translate directly into a win. So the ability to put together a win quickly is really not something that Azorius has the capability to do.
Well, and I think there's also the added layer of like commander support, right? Like, for as much as I love Lavinia doesn't provide much more than very good disruption early out of the gate, right? So you start to look at things and you're like, you look at stuff like Jessica, where Jessica's able to win the game and, control the board and kind of do some of what we're doing and win the game. You look at stuff like, I'm trying to think of other card, like Urza, right? Like, even you drop a color and you have a commander that also acts as a win con. I think commander support, because if you look at the blue-white commanders, like outside of Brago, which one, like what blue-white commander like has the ability in the zone to like win the game?
I think the closest one is Tygam, and his combos are they're incredibly mana intensive, and they require a decent amount of redundancy in some not fantastic cards. And also he's just so threatening that he tends to just be a magnet for any sort of removal.
Right.
I think that one of the sort of interesting things, and maybe when we talk about win cons, is that none of the like if there was an Azorius commander that did something moderately useful and was a scepter outlet, like instantly a deck, because that's actually a combo that Azorius can access reasonably well. Like, blue gives you artifact tutors. You also get your enlightened tutor, and then instants and sorceries are decently accessible. But unfortunately, none of the good Azorius commanders are really scepter outlets. Actually, are none of the Azorius commanders scepter outlets?
No, none of them are.
I guess Azor is kind of a scepter outlet.
If you squint really hard.
I mean, he just has to be able to attack.
There's a person in our Discord, in the Lavinia Discord, who plays Lavinia and then uses Scepter and use a fishbowl as a win con, which you can assemble. It's
do that a lot better.
I think Top does that better, yes, but I think the idea is that you don't have to like rely on Thassa's Oracle or something like that. Like, you could just play overall more high quality cards, I guess.
I mean, we're playing Aetherflux Reservoir, right?
Yeah, but I will say, somebody who has tried it, I didn't like it. It was fine when I tested it. The gaining life part of having Aetherflux Reservoir is like a not unrelevant part, because at some points you end up just getting smacked in the face a lot because people don't like what you're doing.
I mean, I guess that's specifically in Lavinia. I could see that.
Yeah. In Lavinia, it can matter a lot. But But that's kind of the thing, right? I said this before we went on. As somebody who bruises it a lot, I'm just like, blue-white is either a Scepter Outlet commander away or a like decent win con away.
Oh, I guess
from being good.
Vega is technically a Scepter Outlet. It just doesn't do anything else besides be a Scepter Outlet.
Yeah. That's I believe Phoenix like built a Vega deck, and it's just like,
ugh, why?
yeah. You just it's not fun to play. And there's nothing really interesting about it. It's just like,
I mean, I guess
it's a generic.
It's like kind of fun with like future side effects, but I digress. Yeah, it's certainly not a fantastic option, and you'd love to see. I mean, obviously Urza's pretty ridiculous as a card, but even a card that sort of serves two functions, like being consistent card advantage and a Scepter Outlet, or a combo piece and a disruptive element. That sort of thing where you have a commander that does more than just being a one trick pony. Would definitely help.
Yeah. Right. It does seem like most. So, Brago does the thing. Most Brago lists are identical to one another. Most Tigum lists look very similar to each other. Most Lavinia decks are going to be very similar. Grand Arbiter. I mean, there's kind of one way to build the commander, and that's, that's just kind of how they are, because that flexibility is not there.
Yeah. And that's kind of, and like I said, I think it ultimately comes down to like if it had better win cons, I think you could more easily commit to which side of the game plan of blue-white, right, that you wanted to go to. Because then you could be like, okay, well, I'm winning with, let's say I get a good Scepter Outlet that does anything else relevant attached to it, right? And I have that in the zone. And now I can sit there and I can say, okay, now that I know how I'm winning the game, I can go, okay, well, I'm not doing this. I want to do this.
I'm not playing Rule of Law. I'm not playing Stony Silence.
Exactly. Like, it's a lot easier to commit to those things when you know how you're winning the game. Whereas, well, how the hell do I even win the game, right? How do I assemble this? How do I bring it to the table? And that's kind of, I think, where blue-white is, where I think it's still really trying to find its identity right now, I feel like.
I think one more thing that needs to be said about it, too, is not only is it slower than the other color pairings and, relies on these, board present denial pieces to be able to slow everybody else down so that everyone's kind of at parity with their economy of resources. It makes it very vulnerable to things like Cyclonic Rift or, I don't know, Fracturing Gust, or, anything that's going to remove all of your permanents quickly.
Right.
First of all, you lose all of that advantage that you had incrementally put together, and you're set back much further than everybody else, because most everybody else is able to start from an empty board and go quickly, and Azorius is not equipped to do that.
Well, I think the one benefit to that, though, is for some reason people aren't playing Cyclonic Rift right now. So
come on, because it doesn't bounce your dockside. Duh. Somehow I feel like after the string of Winota top fours, we might be seeing an uptick in Cyclonic Rift.
Oh man, hopefully.
I mean, that was always our, over at Into the North, our take was, when you're going into like an open tournament or a blind meta, just have that Cyc Rift in there for the weird stacks matchup for when you get paired against like Yasharn or something, and you need like an emergency bailout button. Slot in a Cyc Rift.
I've seen people using Winds of Abandon.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot too.
Can work. It's a little rough if not everything is a creature, right?
Creature oriented, right?
If they play actual Rule of Law or like Root Maze or things like that, or Blood Moon, you can run into some problems.
Next up is probably one of the ones that everybody's going to have an opinion on. That's probably fairly similar. Is Dimir, blue-black.
Yeah, so this one's just not great, right? It's not really a lot worse.
So when I made this comparison on Twitter the other day, and you guys don't watch football, but I'm going to say this for my audience because to me the blue-black and the combo within it, I made the comparison to Patrick Mahomes. I'm going to change the comparison a little bit. I'm going to say it's more similar to having Thrasios in demonic, or not Thrasios, Thassa's Oracle and demonic consultation in your deck is like having Tom Brady on your team. You're going to get so many free points or free wins in our case, right? That other colors just don't get, right? Because you're able to just, how many times have you sat down at a table, Morgan, and somebody's just go land, Mox, Diamond, Pass. And next turn they go land, Thassa's Oracle, demonic consultation. You're just like, well,
I guess.
I guess, right? Like, and so when we look at blue-black, right? Like everybody's really high on red, right? But how blue-black still got it, right?
It certainly does. In the 2-color league that Nexus did, I guess last fall, I played one of the decks that I played for that was Kells, and I lost a game with it because I was an idiot and forgot that the face down card on my board was a Gitrog monster, and so I got killed with my Oracle trigger on the stack because they killed a land of mine, and I just didn't respond because I forgot I had a Gitrog monster. But like it just felt like the deck had so many. I mean, it had incredibly high card quality. It had very consistent access to the good cards in the deck, and it just had it got so many free wins off of Oracle, and like, I was playing a Nas Scepter Consult deck. Like, there was a time when people would have said that combination of adjectives, obviously in a different color combination and with better commanders, was the best deck in the format. Like Consult Scepter Thrasios, would have been probably shortly after the Flash ban. That might have been a lot of people's answer for the best deck in the format. And like, there I was, Consult, Oracle, Tainted Pact, all the black tutors, Scepter, Nas. Like, Scepter plays really nice with Nas because you want a lot of the fast mana, and then also it's a colorless, like, assuming you have both the pieces, it's a colorless win con after Nas, which just makes it a lot easier to assemble because, when you have like this 0 mana state and then you go like, okay, well, I have this Lotus Petal, and then you look at your hand and you're like, well, I can cast the Soul Ring, but then I can only cast colorless stuff. It's like, okay, sure, yeah, I'll go Soul Ring, Mana Vault, off to the races. And so like just as a color combination, I guess I'll be a little bit more formal. But obviously, you're looking at various types of combo decks, strong control elements provided by blue, and then some of the commanders will have sort of their own flavor. We've seen a couple different decks that were turned into Reanimator decks. I remember people played with Lazav when he was spoiled. People have experimented with Arami. There's obviously Yuriko and stuff like Sig and Nimris, where you just try and play this control and have like some massive card advantage in the command zone. And then, there's, I still believe that the best Dimir deck is unfortunately just Kells because she's a Scepter outlet. And she's the best Scepter outlet in the colors, and then you just play Nas Consult Scepter. And you have, as we've said, the tutors from black, the stack interaction, Nas, Necropotence, Peer if you want it. You got your Time Twisters and Windfalls, and all your blue staples, Remor and Study. Cards like Yawgmoth's Will, and also I think a big one in this is Mnemonic Betrayal, which obviously is a very meta-dependent card, but is excellent in sort of very turbo-heavy metas where people are launching wheels and playing lots of rituals and fast mana and things like that, where like they'll just be loaded graveyards, and sometimes Mnemonic Betrayal often Mnemonic Betrayal just reads, I win the game, somehow how it happens is a formality, but and then you've got the new Malevolent Hermit, the slightly less new Douthie Voidwalker, and you can play Notion Thief and Opposition Agent and all of that. You can still go pretty fast. Obviously, you don't have Dockside, and you miss some of the rituals and things like Spirit Guide from Red, but you still get the best rituals ever printed in Dark Ritual, Cabal Ritual, Culling the Weak if you have things to enable it. And yeah, your weaknesses are, we had to reach a little bit here. You struggle to deal with non-creature permanents, but even that is like asterisked by the fact that bounce spells exist, and there are like a lot of them. There are so many different disperse variants that, if something's a problematic permanent, obviously you can deal with it long enough to win the game, or deal with it and then just counter it on the way back down. And you also kind of wish you could have things like the to battlefield tutors in green, particularly for accessing Thoracle. But like these are weaknesses that are, I would say they're sort of relative weaknesses as opposed to absolute weaknesses, compared to some other colors that really struggle to deal with these sorts of things. And yeah, Dimir's great. And Dimir plus more colors has been the meta for
a very long time.
Yeah.
Since 2016, I would say, at least.
I would agree. I think the weaknesses are not, like you said, they're not necessarily weaknesses, but they're things that would make Dimir stronger. If it had an analog to Eldritch Evolution or Neoform in Dimir, then you would never need to leave the house because Dimir would just do everything
sit
for you.
Inside and play with yourself all day.
Just keep tapping your scepter over and over again. One of the interesting things, and we'll probably circle back to this at some point, but I want to harp on this for a second, because I think people have forgotten about it. There is this level of, I compared it to Tom Brady earlier. When Tom Brady was in New England and they were winning all these championships, the year after he wins the Super Bowl, people are like, oh, they're not that great. They're getting worse and worse and worse. And he's getting old and blah, blah, blah. Then he leaves, he goes to Tampa Bay, immediately wins a championship, right? I think what is happening right now, because I keep hearing this over and over and over, Thassa's Oracle is not that great. It's not as good. Dockside's the real problem. Red's really good. Like, I mean, are people just forgetting that Thassa's Oracle got a card banned, right? Like, got an entire archetype banned out of existence.
It helped. Certainly, the conversations around the Flash ban had been going on for a long time before then. And the fact that Thassa's Oracle shored up the weaknesses of Flash Hulk in such a disgusting way probably provided the final impetus. But I would say that I get where people are coming from when they say that Oracle is not that bad, because often it's the thing that comes before it that looks like the problem, right? You cast a Naz. The fact that Oracle exists, like, people have been winning by casting ad nauseum since long before Oracle was printed, right? Obviously, Breach was printed at the same time, but people are winning with Breach in colors where they can't play Oracle. Like, that Mardu Turbo Naz decks still win with Breach without too much trouble. And so it's very easy to say, like, oh, Breach is the problem, or Dockside, is the problem because it just casts the Naz, or, ad nauseum is the problem. Like, those are very easy things to say. I think that what separates something like Tim Necrom or, 5-color Storm decks or some of the better Grixis decks from something like Mardu or Mardu or like lower color decks or Jund or Rakdos is what happens when things start to go wrong. And I think that that's had a knock-on effect of like, okay, if I play Collector Roof against Kess, let's say, I feel good about that, right? I'm like, okay, a lot of their mana is artifact based. They're not going to be able to go off with a dockside. This is nice. I've, set them behind. Whereas, like, if I play Nullrod against a Rakdos Turbo Nas deck, I'm like, well, that's
the game is over.
Dealt with. As long as they can't destroy the Nullrod, they are not going to be a threat. And I think that the existence of such a powerful pivot through most of the hate that people might play to target your artifacts or to target Breach, so I've been playing decks with Cage in them recently, and I've been enjoying that. But like the fact that you could slam a Cage against a Breach deck, right? Like I'm playing against Kess, it's like, okay, this is a Breach deck. Kess casts stuff out of the graveyard. And then the Kess deck goes like, cool, end step Vamp Tutor, untap, like Oracle Consult. And I'm like, well, fantastic.
Cool.
Like they have such an easy pivot that it makes it so much harder to justify actually hating out the problem cards. And so, Breach is, on its own, it has more pieces and is harder to assemble than something like Oracle Consult. But when you start to play a game, you get wheeled once or twice. Then it's like, oh, this tutor, I can just play this tutor, find Breach, replay the tutor, find LED, off to the races. So then, and because people aren't going like, oh, well, I'll just put Rest in Peace in this deck. Oh, I'll play my Grafdigger's Cage. I'll play even something like a Dryad Militant. Like, people are just going, is it worth it to play these cards? Because they're just gonna play Oracle. Like, I think that means that, Breach then becomes free because no one's hating it. So then you're like, okay, well, I'll just go for Breach because, I have the setup for it. And so then people see Breach win a lot and they go, oh, Oracle isn't the problem. But I wonder, in a world where Grafdigger's Cage does more against a Grixis or, Sans Green deck, is Breach as good?
Right.
I think another thing that I think dovetails in with that is that, so you had said, ad nause has been a thing forever. And long ago, people used Tendrils of Agony to win. And, if they needed to, they would cast their Tendrils of Agony, get a whole bunch of triggers, and then bounce Tendrils of Agony back to their hand from the stack and then cast it again.
Classic Storm.
Right. But the idea is that getting the nause just meant that you got a lot of cards. Converting the cards into a win took effort. It took work. And now it doesn't matter whether you're on Breach or whether you're on ad nause or any other kind of degenerate one card that creates a huge amount of advantage. The de facto way to convert access to those cards is just Oracle Consult. And
I mean, how many times have you seen somebody ad nause and they flip over Oracle Consult and the table just goes, oh, well, there it is. Right. Like,
right.
Yeah. Okay, but we'll wait for you to flip one more piece of mana and then, all right, good talk.
Like, all right, good game.
Right. If there is no Oracle Consult, then that ad nause becomes a whole lot more unpredictable, because the next best thing when there is no Consult Oracle is quite a bit behind that and requires, Aether Flux Reservoir, or, who knows what other contraption you're going to use depending on your color combination to pull a win. It's a significant difference. So
I mean, look at Mad Farm, right? Like, look at the things Mad Farm has to do. Like, it's significantly better now than it was, but before they were running like World Gorger Dragon Loops and all these things. Are they still doing
good old Leonin Relic Warder?
Yeah, like they're doing all these things to try and make it work. When it turns out like Jessica simplified that a lot for them, but not having that easy win with blue makes those blue Nas decks a lot harder to win with.
Right. People used to win with Doomsday before Lab Maniac was printed. It was a lot harder to win with Doomsday before Lab Maniac was printed, but
I mean, even after Lab Maniac was printed, you still had to your sort of no resource line. You had to have your Gush online. You had to have it certainly wasn't like easy. You had to do like the LED Yogg Will stuff, and then you had to be able to, whatever your thing that drew the first card was, you had to be able to draw one more card with it. So like it was fine if it was Probe, like Ponder meant you needed another blue mana. If it was like Top, then you had to do like a bunch of workarounds because the Top went on top of your deck, so you had to get one card deeper and blah blah blah.
The point is that those cards that are so good because of the presence of Oracle Consultation. When Oracle Consultation goes away, they get taken down
a lot,
multiple notches, because assembling a win con without those two cards is significantly more effort.
And one of the things I want to say is, I want to say this before anybody in our comments even says anything. Well, my way of doing it with Underworld Breach is with Brain Freeze. Like,
I mean, sure.
Like, yes, but you're still having to work for that, right? Like, are people not?
You're still playing Brain Freeze.
Yeah, Brain Freeze is not a good card. I just want to make sure people are aware of that. It is a bad Magic card.
It's not a bad Magic card, but it's not a great,
I'll have you know,
nuanced.
I'll have you know that Brain Freeze won us the Nexus Super League final. Turns out,
but you know what I mean? Like, what do you say to people, Morgan, when they go, "Well, I just use Brain Freeze as my one with Breach. Oracle doesn't even play it." Like, what do you say in that situation? Right?
I mean, I say that sure, Breach is. I mean, am I saying that Breach is an okay Magic card? Like, no, of course it's not an okay Magic card. Any card that gets, earns bans in Legacy, I think we can sort of agree, okay, maybe this one was a little pushed. But I think that Breach has a lot more surfaces that can be interacted with. It has a lot more moving parts. And like saying that it's obviously the next best thing, or that it's better than Oracle, is just something that I don't think can really be backed up, especially when the things that hate on Breach specifically hate very effectively on the other kinds of things that Breach decks tend to be doing. In a way that like a Null Rod generally stops a Breach from winning. It also just is very good against, ad nauseum. It's good against ad nauseum and Peer, right. And like these sorts of, play some big insane card draw spell and then try and assemble a win from having little mana because you played your insane card draw spell. And it does basically nothing to Oracle Consult. We've seen a trend towards playing Rule of Laws, which are sort of the thing that does hit both. But Rule of Laws are, in terms of how much they affect everyone, are insanely hot. Like, it's insane how much a rule of law does to even a deck that's ostensibly built to play under rule of law. Like, it is a hard effect to play around, even if you're set up to play around it. Whereas, like, if you're playing, a mana-based deck with like 4 artifacts in it, most of the time you could just ignore Collector Roof, right? Like, you just actually do not care that it's in play. Whereas if you're playing even like a stacks deck, that generally just plays permanents or whatever, even if you have some way of breaking parity on it, rule of law is still very much, you have to plan your turns around it. And it's like, okay, I want to put the rule of law in play as soon as possible, but like, can I afford one more turn where I play like 2 or 3 permanents out to try and develop, or like, does it have to come down this turn? Running rule of law has a lot of requirements around it, and that's the piece that is effective against both Consult and Naz. Whereas,
so, in other words, you're saying rule of law decks should be Kodama decks.
I'm saying that even when they are Kodama decks, that's not necessarily enough. Like, you're still very much disrupted. I would say even with Kodama out, you're more disrupted by a rule of law than something like than you would be by a Collector Roof, I guess is how I would put it.
Okay.
Like, if you're playing, say, Abzan stacks, I think most of the time you actually 100% fully ignore Collector Roof. And even if you have Kodama out, the rule of law will still be inconvenient sometimes. You'll play
It'll be inconvenient more than the Collector.
Yeah, you'll play your spell and you'll be like, do I put the extra land out? Do I put the other creature out? I can't do both. Like, or whatever it is. You start drawing cards with Timna, and then it's like, well, I can't put all of these out. Someone tries to remove something and you can't defend it because you have a veil, but you cast a spell on and your thing's getting countered. You can't cast the veil because there's a rule of law. Whatever it is,
yes,
will still disrupt you. Like, rule of law is an incredibly disruptive piece to pretty much every deck.
So we're talking about rule of law in our coverage of Dimir.
Because rule of law is the only thing that actually hits everything that Dimir tries to do.
Let me ask this then, because I know there's a lot of people who play like Hushbringer, Torpor Orb, stuff like that. Like, is that actually a reasonable piece to be plotting into decks? Because it does hit like a reasonable amount of things that are going to be playing. It hits Dockside, it hits Thoracle, it does disrupt Ranger,
Gilded
Drake, stuff like that. Although then your opponents do get a 2-mana 3/3 that flies. Isn't great, but
it's okay with Timna. It's like a 2-mana for, it's better than Dark Confidant.
Well, it's not great for you, I guess, is my point, right? Like, it's like, all right, well, they got a beater. Like, is it reasonable, Cobblepott, in this world, in this environment, to be saying, okay, I'm going to be playing Torpor Orb, I'm going to be playing Hushbringer, these sorts of things? Like, is it worth it? Because I know in my deck building, I tend to steer away from them because I've just kind of been like, I don't know that I think it's worth it to include this. What are your thoughts on that?
I would say that it's meta dependent.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a metagame that is absolutely saturated with Dockside and everybody is copying Dockside and bouncing Dockside and reanimating Dockside and, winning with Oracle, then that might be enough to warrant the inclusion of, Hushbringer or, Torpor Orb or something to that effect. In a blind meta, I don't know if the expected value is going to be high enough to warrant the inclusion, just because you don't know enough about what your field is going to look like.
You might have to play against Yasharn, right?
Right. So I think it really depends on what the landscape is as to whether it's appropriate.
Okay, well, I mean, here's my response to that question. Okay, let's, in order, take turns naming decks that when you put a Torpor Orb out, you're like, okay, I feel safe. That deck can't win. I'll go first. Vanifar combo. What's next? Anything?
Well, okay. So let's say that you have a Hushbringer out and you're playing against an Ad Nauseam Breach deck that doesn't have Brain Freeze, let's say.
They're playing Mardu Farm.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. How do they win? So the idea is you've got a means of getting an arbitrary number of cards into your hand, but you have a deck that is streamlined such that the only actual I win is Oracle.
Well, I mean, okay, this doesn't feel like a deck that I'm ever going to see. They're playing, like, they're in blue, they're playing Oracle, they're playing Breach, they're not playing Brain Freeze, and they're not playing anything else that enables Breach combos.
But is it disruptive to some of that stuff? Though, I guess is my thought, because it stops Thassa's Oracle, it disrupts Dockside. It to some extent does stop like Winota's win cons too, right? Like,
sure, it stops Winota's combos. It doesn't stop you just dying,
getting smacked in the face.
Right.
Like I guess what I would say is, first of all, so something like Mardu Farm, most of them will have some torpor or proof line, whether that's they're playing Jessica and they have like a Bomberman type combo, or possibly they have like a grinding station line where they can just breach through their entire deck until they find a removal spell. The Nas can draw them into removal spells. Like, if they can still play all their rituals and artifacts and cast Ad Nauseam, I don't think it's reasonable to say you're safe from any deck that's playing those.
Is that necessary before slotting a card, though?
So
do you not slot a card unless you can say that you are incontrovertibly safe from certain decks if you have that card in play?
No. So yeah, I don't think it has to hard shut out some number of decks for it to warrant play. But I think that looking at it as a hate piece, I mean, first of all, it's unfortunately broad. Like, almost every deck has some number of things that it wants to be doing that are impacted by it. So, like, I was looking at putting it in cats, right? And I was like, we're playing consult, but a lot of the time I'm assembling that through Razaketh anyways. I can just sack the Hushbringer, and then I'm like, okay, but then I also can't Spell Seeker. The Eternal Witness is offline. Like, okay, that's kind of annoying. So like Spellseeker, Gilded Drake, I mean, often these decks want to be playing their own dock sides. A lot of the lower color decks are on things like Recruiters as supplementary tutors.
Yeah.
So it will shut off like some of the things you want to be playing, and it doesn't hard hate anyone else out. And I think that I'm not saying there are no decks that can play them, but I think that they often disrupt you a little bit too much and don't do quite enough, and the calculus just doesn't look very good.
Let me say this. Tomorrow, Wizards, I don't put it past them, prints an asymmetrical Hushbringer effect. Is that worth playing?
It certainly merits more consideration. I probably wouldn't put it, like, I wouldn't just slot it into decks willy-nilly. It might go in some more hate bear-centric decks, particularly ones that are more color limited. If I was playing, I don't know, 3-color or 2-color hate bear or whatever, that would certainly warrant a consideration.
Yeah. Good talks. I know we're a little, off. We're not just talking about Dimir. We're kind of talking about, well, how do you beat Dimir's win cons here? But I think it's interesting conversation. And I think that it's definitely important to be talking about when we're talking about these, like, okay, well, how the hell do you stop these things? And so next, when we're talking about that, we're kind of talking about the next part in this black side of the allies here is Rakdos with black-red. And so when we look at that Cobblepott, you're just kind of talking about black-blue and comparing it a little bit to a lot of the stuff that's going on in red with Breach, with Dockside, all these things. Red's been getting a lot of support recently. Where does that leave Rakdos? Because, a few years ago, Rakdos was not really well regarded, right? Like people kind of were like, red's not that good. I mean, people think red's like one of the best colors now. Like, what do you think, Cobble?
I would agree. So when you transition from Dimir to Rakdos, basically what you're doing is you're trading your stack interaction for the most part for acceleration. Yes, red can still interact on the stack with, red elemental blast and deflecting SWAT and, that kind of stuff. But really it kind of ends there. And what you get instead are your Docksides and your Jessica's Wills and, the breach combos and those sorts of things. So you are getting a faster game. And you still have access to black, so you can assemble your combos very deterministically, very consistently. So it's going to generally be a get to the combo as fast as you can kind of a deck. And, some people have had success with Anya. Some people have had sex with, they've had sex with Grenzo Doomsday. That's been a long time ago, though. I don't know if that ever... Is that still even in the database? Grenzo Doomsday?
It was during the league.
Yeah, it is.
It was during MLC. Because Killstars played it.
Yeah, I mean, I still think it's a solid contender for the best Rakdos deck. Because it can more or less do any of the things you're doing in Rakdos anyways. Plus it has the Doomsday setups. It's a World Gorger outlet too.
Yep. So it's as far as strengths are concerned, it's got excellent rituals from the red side and from the black side. It's got excellent tutors from the black side. Great card advantage kind of from both sides. Got the Gnaws, Necropotence, and Peer into the Abyss, along with Wheel of Fortune, Wheel of Misfortune, and so on. Great recursion from both sides. So you've got your reanimation package from black, you've got Yogwill from black, but most importantly, you've got Underworld Breach from red. And that, along with Wheel of Fortune and LED or, any number of other combinations of things, are able to just let you go off to the races. And because of the fact that you got the black tutors, you can very quickly get the mana that you need and find the pieces that you need to put together and then just execute them. So it's racing colors. As far as weaknesses, wait, go ahead, Callahan.
It's interesting to me. It's funny. We don't need to talk about this too long. I just think it's funny how, you're talking about, it's got Yogwill, but the real attraction is Underworld Breach. Like, could you imagine 2 years ago, anybody... If I looked you dead in the face and was just like, hey, they're going to print a better Yogwill.
I mean, we can, I tweeted it when it was printed.
Yeah.
And said, this looks, if I'm reading this right, this looks better than Yogwill. And that was not a well-received tweet. But looking back,
how far we've come.
I still think that I do think that Underworld Breach is the better card. And Spleen is laughing.
I was just reminded of, on the spoiler thread, I remember someone commented something, they said something like a regrowth with extra steps. And then I replied with the understatement of the century, which was, I think this is a little bit better than a regrowth.
Yeah. But go on, Cobble. It amazed me because when you're talking about it, right? Like I remember playing, these games 2 years ago, and Yawgmoth's is great. Nobody plays it anymore, right? Like, even in these decks, are people really playing Yogg's Will anymore?
I mean, Yogwill still sees play, and especially in decks with black. But that was a joke. It's, having the redundancy to be able to win after a Naz, and, just cast a bunch of spells, cast Yogwill and keep going, cast those spells again. There's a lot of value there in having that flexibility to be able to choose either one. Moving to the weaknesses that Rakdos has, and it's not a lot. As I mentioned before, it doesn't have great interaction. So, after you have exhausted your deflecting swat, your red elemental blast, and your pyroblast, you really don't have a lot. And what that means is, 1, you can't police the table. 2, you can't protect your own combo. So really what it becomes is you're just trying to go as fast as you can, because you're not going to generally win the long game, especially if there's people who are going to, put artifact hate onto the board and so on. You got to try to win as fast as you can. Also has trouble with removal. So black forever has had notorious challenges removing artifacts and enchantments. That's changed recently, but the options are still not great.
2 pieces of enchantment removal.
Yeah.
And its artifact removal was, Karn or
Gate to Phyrexia.
Gate to Phyrexia. So not a whole lot of options there. Now the red side does have Vandal Blast and, all the other iterations of that. Meltdown is a tremendous card, but in red black, you kind of want those artifacts. But so long and the short of it is you either win quickly or you lose.
Right.
So
yeah,
there's a ton of combos.
Especially
unless you're Prosper.
I'm not sure if this is still true, but I remember looking it up once, and there were more cards in red that specified non-enchantment than could actually remove an enchantment, even in, and this is counting stuff like World Fire as enchantment removal.
Wow.
But there's 3 or 4 cards that specify non-enchantment, and that's more than all of the red cards that can remove enchantments.
So, needless to say, if somebody sticks a rule of law, the Rakdos player is not the one who's going to get everybody out of that situation.
Unless it's an arcane laboratory, and then they can potentially do something.
Yeah,
they have the one out. When we look at these combos, right, we've talked a little bit previously. Everybody knows Dockside wins. We talked a little bit about Breach, sort of stuff like that. But there's still World Gorger gets play, right?
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of options in Rakdos for combos that do see play. You've got your Dockside, you've got your Breach. Doomsday still sees play in certain places. World Gorger with Animate Dead still sees play. You see a lot of Dual Caster and Twin Flame, just because both cards are reasonably good, depending on your deck individually and not necessarily together. And you still see Kiki Jiki combos. I don't know if Blood Pod or any of those other things is still getting play. I don't see it. And beyond that, there's people doing Conspicuous Snoop and other people doing things with Magda. So there's a whole bunch of breadth to the available ways to win a game.
What is it? One of the ways Phoenix is probably going to kill me because I'm going to murder this. Because isn't one of the ways Prosper wins is through doing Mayhem Devil loops? Right.
Mayhem Devil is often
is an outlet.
An outlet just because it's great on its own, just incidentally being able to ping off, everybody's Notion Thieves and their dorks and so on. But
or just save being a fetch, wait for somebody else to crack something and you get a Timna or Douthie, or it's a hell of a card.
Right. But I mean, it's pretty straightforward to get a Mayhem Devil with Cloudstone, Curio, and Dockside, and there's you've won.
What's the not Dance of the Dead, Corpse Dance, and Dockside, and Mayhem Devil. You sack 2 of the treasures to ping the Dockside. You sack the rest of the treasures to ping everyone else. Corpse Dance with buyback. Repeat.
Yep. Those are, and again, those are win cons that you're not just gonna stick randomly, after, I mean, you could after like an ad naus or something like that, the way that somebody can pivot into a Oracle consult.
They're a lot more all
in response. Yeah. So it's not on the same level of Oracle consult. None of the combos that they have.
And this is kind of a good comparison to this, right? Because, we talked about how these are a lot more all in. If I go turn 3, right? I go Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation. I try to go for the win and it gets countered. I'm like, all right, whatever. I'll try it again later, right? Like you just kind of like shrug and keep going, and then it doesn't end your game. I think that's kind of the problem here is when you look at this, it's like if somebody's doing World Gorger Dragons loops and you time your swords at the right time, they just don't get a field back, right? Like you just take them completely out of the game. So that's where I think the difference is when you look at these win cons, they're a lot more vulnerable to that interaction that like Thassa's Oracle just isn't.
Yeah, and I mean even if you're even if you're not obviously World Gorger is like particularly vulnerable combo, but even something like Dualcaster Twin Flame, first of all, removal just actually works against it, unlike Thassa's Oracle. You can just remove whatever Dualcaster Mage is being targeted by the Twin Flame and break the loop. But also, it's, first of all, the second card you have to run if you want redundancy is Heat Shimmer, and Heat Shimmer actually a worse card than Tainted Pact, like by a lot. And like if you're in Rakdos, it's a lot easier to get an Oracle that's on the field, assuming you're comparing, Oracle and then Consult gets countered to Twin Flame, you cast the Dualcaster and then your Twin Flame gets countered. Running the second redundant piece, Tainted Pact and Heat Shimmer, is a bigger commitment. Finding it is not necessarily easier, because in blue, if you're in Dimir, you can find Tainted Pact with all the black tutors that you get in Rakdos, but also with your mystical tutors and stuff like that. Solve the equation if you're playing it Spellseeker.
Gamble's a universal tutor.
You have a Gamble in your deck for sure.
There's also,
and if you have Underworld Breach, that's a 1 mana demonic tutor,
I suppose. But also,
there's also the added layer with this though, when we're talking about comparing those two combos, right? Where if somebody you do your Heat Shimmer Dualcaster loops, they counter the Dualcaster or the Heat Shimmer. You don't have to figure a way out to get the Dualcaster back to your hand.
Yes, which in Rakdos is a lot harder than getting Thoracle to your hand is in Dimir, for sure.
Right. And this is, I'm saying this very explicitly because I want everybody to know that Thassa's Oracle is still the best combo in the format, and it ain't even close, right? Like, it's not even close, and it makes everything worse. But so we've got all these things. Now, moving on a little bit to some of the less crazy stuff. Let's look at Gruel. And we were talking about, it was funny before we went on, Cobble was like, well, what do you see in Gruel other than Rurikthar, right? And Morgan had listed off some stuff that you've played against. So when we're talking about Gruel here, Morgan, what are the stuff that we're going to see? What's it really doing? What does it do well? And what does it do poorly?
Sure. So I think Gruel's biggest thing is definitely creatures. Like pretty much all Gruel decks ever have been creature based. And that makes a lot of sense because even if you think red is the more powerful color than green, green is just a color with way more depth than red, and its big thing is creatures. So you can play, like, if you look at how many, if you look at how many red cards are in a mono red deck, it's not that many. If you look at how many green cards are in a mono green deck, it's a lot of green. And so something like green red tends to be green dominated, which means you're doing creatures. You have some pretty solid ramp. You have the creature, you have all the creature ramp. You do get dockside, but you also get the option of hating on artifacts and just leveraging the creature ramp. So that's sort of a direction that different decks can go. You can also play your artifact hate and still run dockside, because sometimes you don't have one or the other, and when you don't, the other one's very powerful. You have an excellent ability to protect your stuff from being interacted with. You've got your Veils, Pyroblast. You have some of the more permanent stuff like Shusher and Allosaurus Shepherd and Destiny Spinner. So you're very, very good at stopping people from stopping you. Less good, perhaps, at stopping other people from doing stuff. You can do breach things, though this is probably not the best color for it, because you don't have you struggle in terms of the access to either the tutors to enable it or the actual like cards to enable it. If you compare to Rakdos, obviously you don't have like Demonic Tutor, which is so insane with Breach that it, with a few cards in graveyard and a bit of mana, it's basically a 1-card combo. Or if you compare it to Izzet, you don't get like the Brain Freeze. And when you're trying to do gamble setups, going into some 2-card mill engine like Mana Crypt Grinding Station or something like that is a lot harder on that sort of initial setup, because then you have to cast the gamble from the bin twice, and then when you're casting 3 gambles over the course of a turn, the odds that you discard one of the pieces is very high. So now you're looking at like 12 cards that you need in your graveyard to go off. But I guess it is an option for, and also when you tend to play super creature heavy decks, you tend to be putting cards onto the field, not into the bin. But you do have other forms of recursion, obviously your regrowths, Ewits, Noxious Survival sort of stuff. There's some flashback and flashback adjacent stuff in red. And then you can play Welders, so you have sort of decent graveyard access, especially because a card like Ewit or the Welders are very accessible when you have all your green creature tutors. You have some land support, decent artifact and enchantment, and passable creature removal. Obviously, damage-based creature removal is pretty consistent in this format. A lot of it misses like very specific stuff that is important, like a lot of the bolts and bolt type cards don't hit stuff like Crom, obviously, which is not great, but they do hit a lot of the more, I would say they hit a lot of the more directly problematic permanents. The stuff that actually stops you from playing your game plan generally dies to bolt. It's just stuff that lets your opponents do their game plan, maybe doesn't. In terms of weaknesses, obviously, we talked about your interaction is generally limited to protecting your stuff and removing permanents. You don't interfere with other people's spells on the stack. Like you have pretty much nothing to say about ad nauseum on the stack, for example. You tend to be on the slower side because creatures are just sort of inherently slow in this format, largely by virtue of the fact that they're affected by summoning sickness. So when you play creature-based acceleration suites, they tend to not be quite as explosive. And your win cons, win cons in Gruel are in a weird place. There's just like not quite a good enough creature-based win con. Like you can do Kiki stuff, but when you're just trying to cast or tutor and play 2 halves of a Kiki stuff without sort of a double enabler like a birthing pod type line, it's not fantastic. there's like the Yisan based or like Yisan setups with priests and Wirewood symbiotes and stuff like that you can do. There are dockside loops, but generally, again, your dockside loops are kind of rough because like Cloudstone Curio is very, very difficult to find in Gruel, for example. So then you're looking at creature-based dockside loops, which typically involve at least, like, it's a 3-card combo, not a 2-card combo. So your win cons are all, like, just not quite there, or like the better ones
got them, though.
Yeah, the better ones don't generally fit with the strategy you're trying to play, and the ones that do are just like not quite as good as some other stuff. It's also, I think, very limited in the commander department. Obviously, Rurikthar is an incredibly powerful disruptive piece, but he does cost 6 mana, and that's a lot.
Not trivial.
People have done stuff with Wart, but I think that everything Wart tries to do is just synergizes so poorly with everything else in green-red that you become so over-reliant on your 6-mana commander that it becomes very vulnerable to people just interacting with Wart, but then also you don't get to take advantage of a lot of the hate that other Gruul decks do because you're trying to do more stormy stuff. And I think that just has a bit of tension. People have played stuff like Grand Warlord Rada to just try and power out, your disruptive permanence faster. There's a few other meme ones, but
there's like Gallia. I know that there's a
Gallia to enable Snoop.
There's a
you can do a
Daryl one on the database.
Yeah, Daryl just gives you some card advantage and a bit of disruption. But he also
don't light our comments on fire.
He also,
because we mentioned that card,
really wants you to play. Well, if we're breaking the seal, then we also probably should have mentioned Glenn when we were talking about Azorius. But that's all I'll say on that. Yeah. Like Daryl, you kind of want to play Clasms to draw, like, you have him out for 2 or 3 turns, make like 9 zombies for your opponents, and then just Clasm them all and draw a million cards. But then you're playing Clasms in a Gruul deck, which is somewhat awkward when you want to be leveraging your creature-based mana. There's just a lot of things that like don't quite fit together. I think another issue is that a lot of the disruptive elements in red, like the stacks elements, green doesn't quite have enough stacks on its own, and but a lot of red's stacks elements are damage-based rather than prevention-based, like in white. Where white has like suppression field, like activated abilities cost 2 more to activate unless they're mana abilities. Red gets Harsh Mender, right? Whenever someone activates an ability, if it isn't a mana ability, it deals 2 damage to them. And this is, first of all, obviously 2 damage is a lot less in a 40 life format than it is in a 20 life format. But it's even worse than that because the way these cards tend to work in 20 life formats is that the body itself also provides a reasonable amount of damage, right? You play, an Eidolon of the Great Revel. Yeah. Eidolon of the Great Revel, and you're like, okay, I'm going to swing with this twice, and it's going to deal 4 damage, and they're going to cast 3 spells, and that's another 6 damage. So that's half of the damage you have to deal to win a game of Modern could come from a single Eidolon of the Great Revel. But even if each of your opponents cast 3 spells into your Eidolon, that's 6 out of 40. But also, if you swing with it 3 times, that's 2 damage to each opponent, not 6 damage to each opponent. And so hitting each opponent once and them each casting 3 spells is 8 damage to each of them, which is 20% of what you need to do, not 50%. And so they just don't complement the prevention effects in green like at all, because you just don't have the density of damage for it to become relevant before you die, other than in the extreme case of like Rurikthar, who deals 6 damage at a time.
Right.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the Blood Moon and Massland Destruction dimension has gone way down in efficacy since the printing of Dockside. So you used to see quite often, decks like Blue Moon or, Rurik Thar or any of the other decks that have red as a dimension that want to play kind of a slow, grindy game, being able to make use of either, the Blood Moons or the, what are the, oh my goodness. There's a couple of them that are, everybody sacrifices 4 lands and does 6 damage to each creature.
Wildfire and Burning of Shimi.
Right.
Right. And then there's a 7 mana one that is 5 and 5.
Right. But, that style
you can't
of
really
card,
do Ponza, right, in this format anymore.
Right. Because mainly the Blood Moon effects turn everybody's lands into the color of Dockside Extortionist. So
and then Dockside mana fixes them.
Yes. Which is a huge kink in the plan there to be able to keep people off of the colors that they need to do what they want to do, especially with the saturation of Dockside that you see in most people's local metagames. So, and going a little bit further, land is not as necessary as it used to be. We're seeing more and more ramp being produced, more and more Moxes keep coming. We've got more Jessica's Will style cards that keep coming, and people play dorks. So the axis upon which Red used to rely for creating permanent disruption is largely just moot. And it wasn't always this way.
You talk about like mass land destruction, right? Like I think there was a time before Dockside that a lot of different decks could talk about playing it, right? Because you are setting a lot of people back. You don't have to worry about Dockside, all that, kind of nonsense. I think now, unless you are playing like specifically Lavinia in your command zone, playing mass land destruction effects is like not a great strategy to be on, because you have no way of leveraging that at all. So because you Armageddon, you have Lavinia out, they cast a Dockside, and you're like, okay, you still have no lands, so you can't do any of the things you need to do to win, right?
I think the bigger issue is that most of the mass land destruction spells are going to be sufficiently expensive that you're not gonna fire them off until after everyone has already spewed as many artifacts onto the table that they can, or dorks and so on. So removing their land is going to be a setback, but it won't be a clinching setback the way that it used to be.
What are you talking about? Going third, I just slam Armageddon on turn 2, right? Get the 2 people ahead of me's 2 lands, 1 person after me's 1 lands, and that's good enough for me.
So as we come to the last of the allied pairings, we're coming to the Selesnya guild, the white-green colors. And so when we talk about, we talked about blue-white earlier and how there's like tension between what blue is trying to do and what white is trying to do. When we look at Selesnya here, Cobblepott, is that same tension present? Or is it
similar? There's still tension there, because I think the strongest thing they can be doing is rule of law, which is going to implicitly carry that kind of tension, because you want to go fast, especially, in Selesnya, a comment. Sithis just got printed, and Enchantress.
I hate that deck for what it's worth, by the way.
Pretty strong.
I've had to play against that so many times on stream. I hate that deck. It's so annoying. I never know what I'm supposed to deal with. I never know where the point of interaction is. Every time I play against Sithis, I'm like, do I counter this? Do I remove that? Like, what are you supposed to hit? Right?
You're supposed to cast Cyclonic Rift.
No, you're supposed to hit the stupid the guy who taps for all the mana. I'm blanking on that.
Oh yeah.
Something Weaver? Sanctum Weaver?
Yeah, Sanctum Weaver.
Sanctum Weaver.
Go, that's the one. Or Seed Criddle. Criddle Witch. That's the
Yep.
Anyway, back to what you were saying. Sorry, I'm just lamenting having to play Reed all the time with that damn Sithis deck.
Right. So this is similar to Azorius because it has that tension there. But I think that green and white is less inclined to want to play a really stack intensive game anyway. It's different. So white against blue is all stack all the time, whereas green is the creature color. I mean, yes, you want to be able to play your green tutors to be able to specifically put the creatures that you need into play to disrupt whatever it is that's happening on the battlefield, or to get your card advantage engines online and so on. But those things fit together in a stacks shell or a hate bears kind of a shell a lot more consistently or self-consistently than Azorius. So you're going to definitely see a lot of the same kind of things. So proactive disruption that's permanent based. So you're going to be vulnerable to cyclonic rifts and things like that. And you're going to be typically slower in your development just because you've got green. So you're going to be looking at dorks as a big part of your mana, and you don't need to have artifact mana. So you can definitely run. And since you're in Selesnya, you have 3 null rod effects that you can run and find. So it's more consistent in that way. The tutors, I mean, yes, you're going to have all of the green tutors and the handful of white tutors that give you access to enchantments and some artifacts and so on. It's the impact that has is that it's going to limit the pool of combos that are consistently able to be assembled. They're mainly going to be creature combos. And because you are generally going to be on a rule of law strategy a lot of the time, you need to do combos that you can execute through a rule of law. So card advantage is reasonable. You don't have anything like Adnaz, but I mean, you do have Esper Sentinel. You've got the whole Enchantress thing, if that's part of what you're doing.
Which is a nice addition to cEDH, I will say. I think that having that archetype is nice.
I think that Rite of Harmony really brings that up a couple of notches, just because
God, I hate that
it triggers off of enchantments and creatures. And if you have a token generator, if you've got a Monastery Mentor live with Rite of Harmony, it's real good. So
yeah, no, I've had to play against it in Agila. It's great.
Yep.
Awesome. So fun. It's a perfectly fine Magic card.
As far as recursion is concerned, I mean, you got all the good stuff in green: Regrowth, Noxious, the Endurance, Ewit, and you've also got Savine's Reclamation, which happens to be good at bringing hate bears back to the table. So there's a lot of flexibility there to be able to respond to what's going on at the table and get things back after they've been removed. And yeah, this is just kind of all denial. So all the rule of law, all the null rod, rest in peace. And if you're that kind of a person, Arcana, Valor's Reach, and those sorts of cards.
Cobble classic.
Chalice. Yep. Weaknesses, again, you can protect yourself. So you've got, silence you can use on somebody else's upkeep, but generally silence people are using to protect themselves on their turn. Same as the veils and that kind of thing. You're very often board committed. So if something happens to your board, then you're set back disproportionately than everybody else, just because your game is less about what's in your hand and more about what you have on the battlefield, because you're disrupting proactively as opposed to reactively. And a lot of the win cons are not necessarily concise. So it's not uncommon to see in Selesnya, beats being one of the win cons.
Right.
Because, you've got like Scrollcraft or, Elish Norn or Linvala plus Living Plane, or, MEL that bounces Village Bellringer to, repeatedly get E-Witness or some other enter the battlefield kind of a thing. You could draw your deck with Sithis if you're bouncing a enchantment creature or so on. But then again, now you've got your deck. How do you win?
Right.
And there's not a lot of great options in Selesnya. Yes. That's kind of it. Finale of Devastation is generally the one card. So if you're in a situation where you can't get creatures onto the battlefield, or, you are in a situation where someone is actively trying to go off,
or you're accidentally in your post-combat main phase.
Yep. Those things happen, and that's, not great.
Right.
The MEL stuff you can do over the top of somebody else's turn, but finding a way to convert it into a win is tricky.
Right. Yeah. It's very interesting. I have, like I said, I was trying to do some stuff with Catilda, and I still think there's something there. I just was as trying to brew a way to like your win cons in green white. I was just like, man, I already deal with blue white. I'm like, this is enough miserable trying to figure out how to end the game. I don't need another tough color pairing. When we look at this, Morgan, when we look at kind of Selesnya, and what would you say is probably at the top end of Selesnya right now?
Well, so I think it's kind of a difficult question to answer. I think Sithis in some ways might be the answer, but I think that I have trouble evaluating decks that I think do better but fail to leverage the best tools in sort of their niche. Where I think that, Sithis can sort of close the game, but not being able to play Rule of Laws is an enormous problem. I think that Sisse is another tricky one to evaluate.
Pour one out for the homies.
Without Paradox Engine.
Obviously, the win cons are a lot worse than they used to be. They've been slowly getting better. I think people have sort of. I know there was a one-turn win that tried to used one of the planeswalkers that could untap a million things, and then you got Chain Veil, and then you did stuff, and it was okay, so now you can't play Null Rod, and you need 6 mana worth of permanence, and your Cradle has to make 5 mana, and just all this stuff that, and then I think people have moved towards we'll just win over 2 turns, which I think is a little bit better. Sereth the Viper's Fang is a legendary tutorable thing that untaps stuff and gives your untapped creatures hexproof. So that can definitely enable. First of all, it protects you, and then the untapping can like enable certain wins somewhat nicely. So Sisay is an option. Yasharn is clearly like the most disruptive, but obviously does nothing to win you the game. There are some meme builds that use like various different. They try and leverage various different combos. Like there's I've seen like a Safi deck. You can use Nazan because he's just kind of an infinite mana outlet. There's green-white Selvala can go infinite with certain things. I feel like that list always includes cards that I'm skeptical will actually consistently go infinite with her. Like Umbral Mantle, consistently hitting 3 non-land cards off the tops of libraries is sketchy, at least in my book. Right. So I think that it's hard to say which one's best just because there are a lot of different axes you can attack on, and they all have, I think, quite serious flaws. And so it's very difficult to sort of evaluate them against each other. And it'll be very meta dependent. Like a deck that doesn't want to play Null Rod but can play Rule of Law might be fantastic in some metas, and in other metas you might really, really wish you were playing the opposite or right. Whatever.
For sure.
Right. Well, that about wraps things up for the discussion about allies. I know we're planning on next week coming back and talking about the enemy color pairings. And so before we take off, Morgan, I know you guys do a lot with Into the North. What are you guys doing over there right now?
We have an episode that we recorded with Nathan Jones, the Hermit Druid, on Twitter. That'll be coming out probably around the time this comes out, I guess. We're still just chugging along producing those. We have some ideas for doing commentary on some of the tier 1 replays when we get around to that. We released one of those a few weeks ago where we played there was an after hours game between the 4 people who were there who had won a tier 1 con event, which included Reed and I, commentated by Comedian and Null from Into the North, and Sick Robot and I, who were in the game, watched their commentary and sort of commentated on their commentary. Just talking about sort of our decisions and where, why we did things we did. And so we were contemplating either doing something like that for some of the rounds that we were in, just part of the main event, or potentially just re-commentating them ourselves. So watch for that. And yeah,
awesome. Well, I know I always love the new stuff that you put out over there, so always a pleasure when that comes out. So with that being said, just a quick reminder, you can follow us on Twitter at SculptyBoys, BOIS, or you can find a direct link to that in our link tree in the description below. Want to also give an extra shout out to all of our patrons who help keep the lights on around here. If you too would like to become a patron, you can head on over to patreon.com/The Mind Sculptors or check out the link in the description. Thank you again for joining us this weekend. From all of us at The Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.
I'm in line with the stars, I'm in sync with the earth. 10 toes deep, flower child from the turf. I never switch sides, like even when I die, I'm a ride for the squad, let her ties in the hearse. I've been on the vibe, kinda hard to describe. I'm in between, I'm good and it's fine, but I'm tired of the grind. Then I come alive in the night to realize I'm in the middle of the time of my life. I never so packed for the stack, never lied on the rap. Got a bag from the way that I write it. Queen looking Tyson, do that ass survive, doing 80 to the house. Then I hit her to the sky, change haters on a tirade. Talking to the crib in the face, be still, let that hate stuff fade. We all want the same, we all want a meal in the safe. I wanna live like I'm trying to reach enlightenment. Trail spill from my lips, feel big from the bib. Take a sip till I pass out. Try and get grit, but it don't make sense, cause you can lose life on this fast route. Yeah, turn thoughts to a cash cow. I might flip that to the glass house. I don't need the accolades, I'm in love with the chase. I just wanna eat, save a spot at the table. Beast with the slap, hit myself on the map. You long with the wind. fear. You're the first one to talk, but the last one to hear. Eyes blurry, but I couldn't see the ass any clear.